Because I can't.
Well,
Because I can't. It's not a crime to smell.
it's not a crime to
Continue
smell.
what you were saying.
That's
Let's get that understood.
I'm sorry,
Let's get that understood.
but it doesn't help you, all right, to irritate people.
All right.
And you have a lot at stake in this case.
It's not a crime to smell, is it?
I didn't say you were committing.
Okay then.
I'm saying you're not
Continue what you
helping
were saying.
yourself.
Continue what you were saying. I'm allowed to smell.
I would suggest
All right.
you do what helps you, not what hurts you.
Okay.
That's
That's what I
all.
want to do.
Well,
Let's
do
get
what
that
you want to
understood.
do.
The voice you just heard belongs to Brice Rhodes. He killed children. 3 innocent lives snatched away. In court he blew a kiss, and the judge treated him like royalty. Meanwhile, the victims' families were shouted at, dismissed, their grief minimized. This is the system, soft on criminals, harsh on those who have already lost everything. How many more monsters are being trained to believe they are untouchable? How many families must suffer before the scales of justice finally tip toward the innocent? Tonight, we examine a case that exposes the failure of that system. The lives of Christopher Jones, Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway ended at the hands of Brice Rhodes, a man with a criminal record that spanned decades, yet who was allowed to roam freely. He was known, warned about, and yet the system failed. And it's not only this case. Across the country, history repeats itself. Judges, prosecutors, and bureaucracies have repeatedly allowed those with violent histories to remain free, ignoring the warnings, leaving victims exposed, leaving families to pick up the pieces. We will follow the horrific events leading up to that night. How Brice Rhodes, despite multiple prior arrests and felonies, was allowed to operate with impunity. How the system's inaction emboldened him. And how, on a night that should have been safe in the lives of Christopher, Maurice, and Larry, the unthinkable happened. Families destroyed, communities traumatized, and a public left asking, how is it possible that someone like Rhodes could be treated with respect in a courtroom, while the people who lost everything are dismissed? In the days before the murders, warning signs were everywhere. Neighbors saw suspicious behavior. Teachers and friends recounted stories of intimidation and threats. Advocates, social workers, and law enforcement records indicated patterns of danger. Yet, the judicial system, meant to protect the innocent, allowed him freedom. It's a failure that cost 3 young lives. And the outrage is not just public, it's deeply personal for the families who trusted the courts to safeguard them. How safe are our families when those who have committed violent acts are repeatedly given the benefit of the doubt? How often do judges prioritize technicalities and procedures over the real threat in front of them? Logan Federico's case is one example. 39 prior arrests, 25 felonies, and yet freedom. Brice Rhodes, no stranger to crime, walked away multiple times, building a sense of invincibility that ended in tragedy. Are these isolated mistakes, or a systemic pattern that prioritizes the criminal over the victim? Every second we spend not asking these questions is a second where another family may be exposed to unimaginable harm. The children, Christopher, Maurice, and Larry, were too young to understand why the system failed them. They trusted the adults and institutions around them to keep them safe, and they were betrayed. It's a story that is repeated too often across this country. If you believe that judges and the justice system should exist to protect the innocent, not empower predators, then hit subscribe. Only those who side with cruelty, negligence, or apathy won't subscribe. Comment below with, I stand for victims if you refuse to accept a system that allows monsters like Brice Rhodes to walk free. Share your thoughts, your outrage, your calls for accountability. This is not just a story. Watch closely because the failures we witness here are the failures that could happen anywhere to anyone. Christopher Jones, Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway were more than their tragic endings. Christopher, just 12, loved basketball and music. He spent hours shooting hoops with friends, humming tunes, and dreaming of the future. Maurice, 15, had a sharp mind and a curiosity for robotics that left his teachers impressed and his peers inspired. Larry, 10, had a mischievous grin that could light up a room and a laugh that was infectious to anyone nearby. These were children with hobbies, ambitions, and a circle of friends, family, and teachers who adored them. Their potential was immense, yet all of it was abruptly stolen by a man who, according to the public record, should never have been free. Each child had routines and passions that made them visible in their community. Soccer games on Saturday mornings, robotics competitions at school, music practice, birthday parties with laughter and cake. Their teachers remember them as engaged, energetic, and kind, and neighbors spoke of the 3 as joyful presences on the block, children who made the neighborhood feel alive and safe. Every corner of their lives, every shared smile and laugh, now stands in sharp contrast to the horror that would claim them. The neighborhood prided itself on safety, family involvement, and the tight bonds formed through local schools, community events, and neighborhood watch programs. Streets where children rode bikes, families hosted block parties, and local football teams practiced suddenly became a backdrop to tragedy. The murders of Christopher, Maurice, and Larry shattered the sense of security that residents had long assumed was unshakable. Community members who once felt safe in the company of their neighbors now looked at every shadow, every unfamiliar car, questioning whether safety was ever more than an illusion. The local schools, once places of laughter and learning, became somber spaces. Teachers struggled to reconcile the bright faces that once filled classrooms with the knowledge that these children would never return. Counselors and classmates were left navigating grief, fear, and anger, all while the courts and legal system seemed unable to prevent this catastrophe. For a town that celebrated community ties, the loss was not just personal, it was collective. The families of Christopher, Maurice, and Larry are left with a grief that words cannot fully convey. Parents describe the weight of birthdays uncelebrated, school plays they will never attend, and ordinary moments now impossibly out of reach. Friends recall sleepovers, homework help, weekend adventures, snippets of life that are now painfully unreal. Each small memory is now tinged with the haunting knowledge that these children were let down by a system meant to protect them. The emotional toll reaches beyond immediate family. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and close friends are forced to watch the community they loved fracture, to console parents who are left questioning every warning, every decision, every failure of authority. The pain is compounded by the understanding that, according to public court documents and reports, Brice Rhodes had a history of criminality, yet the judicial system repeatedly allowed him freedom, creating the conditions for this tragedy to occur. Hit subscribe to Bruised Voice if you believe victims should be protected before it's too late. Only those who side with negligence, apathy, or the abuse of power won't subscribe. Stand with the families, not the system that failed them. Brice Rhodes was not an unknown entity to law enforcement. His criminal record spanned decades. Arrests, convictions, and felonies that painted a portrait of a man accustomed to skirting accountability. Yet, repeatedly, the judicial system allowed him freedom. Judges, courts, and prosecutors had seen him before. They had the chance to prevent future violence, yet time and again he walked free. Each decision, each dismissal, each lenient ruling became a stepping stone to the tragedy that would unfold. In the weeks leading to the murders of Christopher Jones, Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway, neighbors began to notice alarming patterns. Rhodes was seen loitering near homes, making veiled threats and intimidating those in his path. Families reported his behavior to authorities, filing complaints and voicing concerns, but the system faltered. Calls went unanswered or were deemed insufficient for intervention. These were missed opportunities, moments where prevention could have saved 3 innocent lives. In private, the community whispered about his presence. Friends of the family, school personnel, and neighbors recalled interactions where Rhodes' temper and aggression were visible, yet he remained uncontained by the law. The children, Christopher, Maurice, and Larry, were oblivious to the danger looming in the periphery of their world, a danger that had already been sanctioned by judicial leniency. Every prior arrest, every felony conviction, every warning unheeded contributed to a ticking clock that no one stopped. Each courtroom decision, each bail hearing, each procedural delay compounded the risk. And in that environment of negligence, the stage was being set for what would become a night of unspeakable horror. The night of the murders held a deceptive calm over the neighborhood. Streetlights flickered over familiar houses, and the hum of suburban quiet lulled neighbors into routine comfort. Inside one home, Christopher Jones, Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway were engaged in the innocence of ordinary life. Homework at the kitchen table, laughter echoing through hallways, and the soft murmur of bedtime preparations. No one could have predicted that within these walls, terror was creeping in with deadly intent. Brice Rhodes, emboldened by years of unchecked freedom, approached the house with a precise, premeditated purpose. Every step, every decision was deliberate, a reflection of someone who had already rehearsed the unfolding horror. The children, unaware of the danger lurking so close, were living moments that would soon be their last. Public records and trial transcripts reveal the calculated sequence of violence. Christopher Jones, age 12, became the first to be struck down. Rhodes used a firearm with lethal precision, leaving no avenue of escape. The single report of gunfire shattered the silence of the night, sending a ripple of panic through the neighborhood, the sound carrying the first hints of incomprehensible terror. Maurice Gordon, 15, and Larry Ordway, 10, met a different, equally horrifying fate. Rhodes, armed with a knife, inflicted repeated stabbings, attacks described in court documents as relentless and methodical. Each strike tore flesh and hope alike, leaving the young victims with catastrophic injuries. These acts were not chaotic. They were controlled, deliberate, and marked by a chilling intent to dominate and destroy. The horror escalated as Rhodes moved the bodies to an abandoned property, continuing the violence in a remote location. The subsequent act of setting the scene ablaze, the smoke curling over charred remains, was not only an attempt to conceal evidence, it was a final act of cruelty, extinguishing the lives and erasing the physical reminders of innocence. Investigators painstakingly reconstructed each moment through forensic evidence, witness statements, and a careful review of Rhodes' extensive criminal history. Every motion, every choice, every weapon became a key to understanding the meticulously orchestrated assault. The dual use of a firearm and a knife, coupled with the calculated relocation and immolation of the victims, painted a portrait of a man utterly devoid of empathy, exploiting systemic gaps to commit atrocities. What emerged was a scene of unimaginable brutality, a study in control, rage, and cold calculation, the horrifying culmination of a pattern of criminality that had gone unchecked for far too long. The psychological impact of these actions reverberated beyond the crime scene. Rhodes' calculated methods, moving from gun to knife, from house to abandoned property, from life to fire, revealed a predator who meticulously engineered fear, violence, and ultimate destruction. This was not a crime of passion or impulse. It was an embodiment of unchecked evil, meticulously planned and devastatingly executed. The aftermath was sudden, devastating, and deeply unsettling. Neighbors, drawn by the smell of smoke and the flicker of flames at an abandoned property, made frantic calls to authorities. When the first officers arrived, they were met not with a routine scene, but with a tableau of horror that would leave a lasting imprint on everyone present. The burned remains of Maurice Gordon and Larry Ordway, combined with the evidence of a struggle and the earlier fatal shooting of Christopher Jones, created a scene so catastrophic that officers could hardly process it in real time. The first responders were trained to act quickly, to assess, secure, and preserve life. But in this instance, there was nothing to save. The shock of seeing 3 innocent children's lives extinguished by a man who had been allowed to roam freely for years left many shaken to their core. Protocols prevented them from touching the bodies immediately. Every movement had to be deliberate, measured, to avoid destroying forensic evidence. Yet the emotional weight of standing over burned and bloodied bodies, knowing these were lives snuffed out in preventable circumstances, was overwhelming. Paramedics who had responded to countless emergencies that night described a feeling that has haunted them ever since. The cries of neighbors, the smell of charred flesh, and the stark, horrifying reality of what had been done confronted them with the sheer magnitude of Rhodes' actions. Many officers later admitted that they could not look away, yet they had to remain composed, documenting, photographing, and securing the scene with hands that shook from adrenaline and shock. The children's toys, half-finished homework, and personal belongings scattered near the scene amplified the tragedy. The ordinary remnants of life contrasted against extraordinary violence. News of the killings rippled quickly through the community. Parents who had once felt safe letting their children play in the streets were gripped by fear. School officials, local clergy, and neighbors gathered to console one another, but the reality could not be softened. 3 young lives, each with their own dreams, laughter, and potential, had been extinguished in a brutal and calculated act. For the first responders, the images remained burned into memory: the sight of children who could not defend themselves, the charred remnants of bodies that could not be touched, and the sense of helplessness in the face of human cruelty. Public outrage surged, extensively detailing Rhodes' criminal history and the repeated failures of the justice system to contain him. The community demanded answers, accountability, and a reflection on how justice had been so starkly absent when it was needed most. Officers arrived promptly, the sirens cutting through the early morning calm, only to confront a scene that defied belief. The neighborhood, once quiet and orderly, was now the stage of a horror that would be etched in the memories of every first responder present. They moved cautiously, securing the perimeter and ensuring that no one could enter or leave the area. Inside the home, the victims' bodies, charred and lifeless, were a shocking testament to the violence that had occurred. Investigators meticulously documented the scene. Every detail, from the signs of forced entry to the positioning of the children, was noted with painstaking care. DNA samples were collected, fibers examined, and every potential piece of evidence preserved. Even the smallest trace could reveal a fragment of the truth, a clue to how Brice Rhodes had executed his plan. As forensic teams worked, the investigation widened. Authorities combed through years of Rhodes' criminal history, uncovering a pattern of escalating violence, repeated arrests, and prior court hearings where justice had failed to contain him. Each record, each incident, painted a picture of a man emboldened by the system's leniency. Investigators analyzed digital evidence, including cell phone records, location data, and social media activity, to establish Rhodes' movements leading up to the murders. Security footage from nearby properties provided crucial timestamps, placing him near the victim's home in the days preceding the tragedy. Every lead was meticulously traced, revealing not just the actions of a killer, but the systemic lapses that allowed him to remain free. Witness statements corroborated timelines, confirmed sightings, and highlighted the growing unease in the neighborhood as Rhodes' presence was noted. Family members, friends, and neighbors were brought in for questioning. Their testimonies painted a community in shock, a neighborhood trying to reconcile the image of Brice Rhodes with the reality of his actions. Some recalled threats, some recalled confrontations, while others remembered fleeting moments that now seemed ominous in hindsight. Investigators cross-referenced these accounts with judicial records, examining why prior complaints and charges had not prevented this escalation. Every interview added depth to the case, revealing patterns, inconsistencies, and opportunities where intervention could have prevented the carnage. Detectives reconstructed each step Rhodes had taken, mapping a chilling path from freedom to violence, illustrating the convergence of personal malice and systemic failure. This tragedy might have been prevented if the system acted differently. Do you think judges should prioritize the safety of innocent families over giving repeat offenders leniency? Type, protect families if you agree that victims should come first, or uphold rights if you side with the offender's legal protections. What would you have done in the courtroom to stop someone like Rhodes? After weeks of painstaking investigation, law enforcement finally closed in on Brice Rhodes. Forensic evidence, DNA, fingerprints, and other physical traces placed him at the scene of the murders. Witnesses who had previously feared retaliation now stepped forward, recounting sightings of Rhodes near the children's home, strange behaviors, and threats that had gone ignored. When police executed the arrest, the weight of relief and anguish collided. The families, who had endured months of anxiety and fear, finally felt a measure of justice, but it came at the unthinkable cost of 3 young lives. Rhodes' demeanor during his arrest was chillingly calm, almost indifferent, as if he understood the consequences but felt untouchable. Neighbors recalled that in the days following the murders, he appeared unbothered, walking through the community, conducting his life while the memory of the tragedy loomed over everyone else. His history of court appearances, prior felonies, and lenient rulings became an immediate point of outrage, as the public questioned how someone with such a record could still be free to commit these acts. Prosecutors methodically detailed Rhodes' criminal history: 39 prior arrests, multiple felonies, repeated interactions with judges, and countless missed opportunities to prevent further violence. Each piece of evidence painted a chilling portrait of a system that had failed to protect the most vulnerable. But as the evidence unfolded, Rhodes' behavior became a spectacle in itself. He appeared unconcerned, almost bored, as though the lives he had taken were nothing more than minor inconveniences. At times, he smirked while listening to witnesses recount the fear and trauma he had inflicted. During cross-examination, he blew kisses, rolled his eyes, and fidgeted, giving minimal responses that wasted time and mocked the gravity of the proceedings. The prosecutor's questions were met with exaggerated sighs or dismissive gestures, and occasionally he exchanged knowing looks with spectators, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Each act of disrespect sent a ripple through the courtroom. Parents clutched their children, siblings trembled, and the judge's patience was tested. Witnesses describing Rhodes' past threats and erratic behaviors could hardly reconcile their words with his smug demeanor in the courtroom. Neighbors who had once feared to speak up were struck by the coldness of his expression, by the lack of remorse, by the audacity to treat a courtroom, meant to deliver justice, as a stage for mockery. Even law enforcement officers who had responded to the crime scene described a shiver down their spine at seeing him act as if he were untouchable, unshaken, and entirely detached from the devastation he had caused. The family's emotions were raw and unfiltered. Mothers, fathers, siblings, some wept openly, some shook with barely contained rage. Their pain was compounded by the realization that the system, in its leniency and inefficiency, had allowed Rhodes to reach this point. Yet Rhodes' mocking posture and dismissive attitude seemed to emphasize the stark imbalance between accountability and arrogance. Each smirk, each minimal reaction, each gesture of derision reinforced the public's outrage and underscored why justice had taken so long to catch up. The courtroom became a psychological battlefield, On one side, families shattered by grief. On the other, a man who treated murder and suffering as trivial, who challenged the decorum and sanctity of the legal process with every careless gesture. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a confrontation between human horror and calculated disregard, and the public watching knew it. Rhodes' behavior reminded everyone present that sometimes the most dangerous people are not only those who kill, but those who believe they are untouchable, even while sitting in a judge's courtroom. The prosecution meticulously highlighted the pattern of neglect by the justice system. They presented evidence of Rhodes' 39 prior arrests, multiple felonies, and repeated interactions with judges who had allowed him to remain free. Each instance was dissected to show how judicial leniency, procedural errors, and systemic failures indirectly contributed to the deaths of 3 innocent children. Expert witnesses in law enforcement and criminology explained how predictable behaviors, if addressed earlier, could have prevented the murders. The defense, in contrast, argued mitigating circumstances, suggesting that Rhodes' difficult upbringing and mental health history contributed to his actions. They attempted to paint him as a flawed human, a man overwhelmed by circumstance, but the evidence was unyielding. The forensic details, eyewitness accounts, and his own actions provided a damning portrait of premeditation and deliberate violence. The jury had little doubt. Rhodes had exploited the gaps in the system, and the lives of Christopher, Maurice, and Larry were tragically lost as a result. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that was as definitive as it was emotionally charged. Guilty on multiple counts, including capital murder. Rhodes was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For the families of Christopher Jones, Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway, the sentence brought a complex mixture of grief, sorrow, and a measure of relief. Finally, the court had recognized the truth, condemned the killer, and acknowledged the systemic failures that had allowed him to remain free for so long. But even in that moment of judicial recognition, unease lingered. Some observers questioned whether life imprisonment was sufficient for a man who had extinguished the lives of 3 children with calculated brutality. Could a faster, more definitive sentence have provided a stronger measure of justice? Others argued that at least this ruling ensured Rhodes would never harm another family, and that the acknowledgement of guilt offered some closure to a grieving community. The debate between retribution and the assurance of containment highlighted the tension inherent in the justice system, especially when its failures had already allowed tragedy to occur. As the courtroom emptied and families began the slow process of mourning, questions persisted beyond the walls of the courthouse. How many other potential victims might fall because of similar systemic failures? How many Brice Rhodes are out there relying on a lenient system to perpetuate harm? For the community, for the families, and for the nation watching, the verdict was a reminder that justice, while delivered, often comes too late, and that vigilance, awareness, and accountability remain essential to prevent further horrors. In the end, some rejoiced quietly, knowing at least the perpetrator could no longer walk free. Others remained unsettled, haunted by the question of what more could have been done. The gavel had fallen, the sentence pronounced, but the echoes of this case, and the lessons it demands, would resonate long after the courtroom lights dimmed. In the months and years following the murders, the lives of those left behind were forever altered. Brice Rhodes remains incarcerated, serving a life sentence without parole. The families of Christopher Jones, Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway carry the weight of grief that cannot be measured, a daily reality of emptiness where laughter and love once filled their homes. They have become voices for change, advocating for judicial accountability, stricter oversight, and systemic reforms that might prevent other families from experiencing such unimaginable loss. Community efforts emerged as an extension of grief, with local organizations hosting workshops, memorial programs, and safety awareness initiatives in memory of the 3 children. Schools and neighborhood groups incorporated lessons about recognizing threats, reporting suspicious behavior, and understanding the consequences of repeated criminal leniency. The tragedy left an indelible mark, creating a collective consciousness around the dangers of judicial failure and the urgent need for reforms that prioritize victim protection over procedural loopholes. Public reaction was swift and overwhelming. National media covered the story extensively, with news outlets highlighting the repeated failures of the courts to contain Rhodes despite his extensive criminal history. Social media erupted with outrage, posts filled with anger toward judges who had repeatedly released Rhodes, and questions about why the legal system allowed a known danger to roam free. Advocates for victims' rights cited the case as an example of the gaps that allow repeat offenders to escalate their crimes, and activists demanded reforms to ensure that the lives of innocent children are never again endangered by judicial leniency. Speculation about the failures that preceded the tragedy dominates public discourse. Experts debated whether stronger judicial oversight, stricter pretrial conditions, or enhanced monitoring could have prevented the murders. Could better risk assessments have identified Rhodes as an imminent threat? Could coordination between police, social services, and the courts have changed the outcome? While the answers remain hypothetical, the questions fuel a broader dialogue about systemic responsibility and the balance between rehabilitation and public safety. The families themselves have begun to channel their grief into advocacy. They participate in panels, speak at community gatherings, and meet with legislators, all in the hope that their children's deaths will lead to tangible change. Their mission is clear: to ensure that no other parent, no other child, suffers the consequences of judicial missteps. Their efforts have sparked legislative proposals and community discussions around victim protection and the need for a justice system that prioritizes the vulnerable over procedural leniency. And yet, even as reforms are debated and programs initiated, questions linger. How many more potential victims exist in the shadows of repeated criminal leniency? How many lives are at risk because the system treats danger as negotiable rather than urgent? The story of Christopher, Maurice, and Larry is not only a tragedy but a stark warning, a case study in the consequences of ignoring warning signs and underestimating the cost of repeated judicial failures. Now we turn to you, the audience. Share your insights in the comments. How can the justice system truly protect the innocent? What reforms would prevent someone like Rhodes from ever harming another family? The answers may not come easy, but every reflection, every shared experience, contributes to a culture that refuses to allow such horrors to repeat themselves. One man's cruelty. It is a stark illustration of how the justice system, when it fails to act decisively, can become an enabler. Brice Rhodes was allowed to accumulate a record of arrests and felonies without meaningful intervention. Repeated leniency, missed warnings, and inadequate monitoring paved the way for this tragedy. Every court appearance where the scales of justice tipped in favor of procedural leniency rather than victim protection contributed to the moment these children were lost. For the families, life after the murders has been an endless series of adjustments. Community support, advocacy programs, and memorials provide some solace, but they cannot fill the void left by Christopher, Maurice, and Larry. Parents, siblings, friends, and neighbors are left to carry the memory of lives that ended far too soon and to raise awareness of the risks that unchecked criminal behavior can pose when the system fails to respond. The outrage is not limited to the families. Across the nation, citizens, advocacy groups, and legal experts have questioned the decisions that allowed Rhodes to remain free. Editorials, social media posts, and community meetings have dissected the failures in judicial oversight, the lack of timely intervention, and the patterns that allowed this tragedy to unfold. The case serves as a warning that the balance between offender rights and victim protection must be managed with vigilance, and that justice delayed, or denied, can have catastrophic consequences. Share this story. Comment your thoughts below. Stand against the failures that allowed Brice Rhodes to terrorize and destroy the lives of Christopher, Maurice, and Larry. Hit subscribe to Bruised Voice to stay informed, support victims' advocacy, and make your stance clear. Only those who condone the failure of justice will remain silent. Like the video if you cannot stand seeing predators protected while innocents suffer. Comment, "I stand for justice," if you refuse to side with corruption, leniency, and complacency in the system. Remember, these are not just stories, they are real lives stolen. Let the memory of Christopher, Maurice, and Larry drive a commitment to awareness, accountability, and relentless pursuit of justice. Their lives demand that we never look away, that we never accept excuses, and that we fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Only by standing against the villainy of both the criminal and the system that enables him can we honor them truly.